Welcome back to part 4, how I built my pole barn shop. When we ended at the last video, this is roughly what the shop looked like outside. Inside, I was beginning to install light fixtures and fans on the ceiling, even though half the ceiling was not yet covered in metal. The reason was because it got stored stuff off the floor and gave me more floor space to work. Instead of stacked fans and lights on the floor, they were now hanging on the ceiling. On the other hand, I will freely admit that since it was my project and mine alone, I was the owner, the contractor, foreman, laborer, all in one, that on any particular day, I worked on whatever project I felt like. If I only had a couple hours, I'd try to pick a project that might take a couple hours. But in truth, there was no rhyme or reason why I jumped around. I just worked on what I felt like on that particular day. The end goal was to get it done. It was pretty exciting when I powered up the first fluorescent light that you see here. At this point, the only power I had into the shop was my 400-foot Romax extension cord from my garage, but it did allow me to test each light to make sure it worked and that it was wired correctly. Here you can see when I first powered up half of the 8 LED lights. The LED bulbs only use 13 watts but shine like a 100-watt bulb. That means with all 8 bulbs on, they are putting out 800 watts of light, but only using just over 100 watts of electricity. So they are much cheaper to use than fluorescents. But there are times I like the fluorescents. At my age, I sometimes need extra light to see. And at those moments, I can turn on a bank of fluorescents and see what I need to see. I'll talk about them more later. One of the next projects I tackled was to build out the walls for the bathroom. It was located in the southwest corner of the shop, on the left where you see the ladders in this photo. Here is a view of the bathroom area before concrete was poured. If you look closely, you can see the anchor bolts that would later hold the base of the walls to the bathroom in place. The room is 8 by 10, which is larger than necessary for a bathroom. However, that was by design since I wanted it large enough to put metal cabinets on one wall and use that for a storage room as well. Here you can see the framework of the room taking shape. It is not to the ceiling since having an open area above allows for storage up there as well. It also provides access to the attic door, which you can see is just above. On the outside walls of the bathroom, I used the same white sheet metal panels used everywhere else in the shop. However, in the bathroom itself, I decided to use sheetrock. Here you can see some of the progress, and this was before the end was enclosed. The door I ended up using was a heavy commercial door previously used in a high school. And because I didn't have a commercial steel frame, I decided to construct my own. Here you can see in the door jamb where I placed a 1/4-inch angle iron piece, which was about 3 inches wide. In this next photo, you can see where it wrapped around the outside of the wall. What I did was trim the wood so that it was recessed and didn't stick out beyond the wall surface. By using a piece of angle iron, it provided the required rigidity to hold the heavy door. I drilled about 7 or 8 holes in the steel and then recessed those holes, then used flathead screws to bolt that steel to the wood. Then I drilled some smaller holes, tapped those, and that was where I screwed the door hinges into the steel. Later then, the entire door was finished in with some nice 3/4-inch solid wood pieces. Next up on the to-do list was to cut holes in the outside sheet metal and construct window frames on the west wall. In this first photo, you can see one window has been cut out while the second has not. What I did was drill holes through the outside sheet metal in all 4 corners. Then I used a jigsaw, sometimes a hand snip, to cut out the rough opening. Once the holes were cut, I then used 2x12 boards to make the frame. And once that was done, it was time to install the glass itself. Since I had plenty of 1/4-inch glass pieces, I made the window 3 layers thick to provide for a bit more insulating value. Each glass piece was separated 3/4 of an inch, and that was accomplished by running a 3/4-inch piece of wood around the edge of each glass. You can see that in this close-up photo. The windows are nice and provide some natural light into the shop. And since they're high up on the wall, it provides a bit more security, hopefully to keep a potential intruder out, or at least make it more difficult to get in. You can see here that I had begun attaching horizontal tubophores to the inside wall. Behind them was the plastic vapor barrier and then 4 thicknesses of 1.5-inch insulation boards. Like everywhere else in the shop, the 20-foot tubophores were staggered so as to not have any butt-in joints directly above or below each other. These, of course, would later hold the white vertical metal panels inside the shop. Here are the upper windows installed on the east end of the building. Those were built roughly about the same time as those on the west end. And as you can see, when this photo was taken, many of the vertical white wall panels were also up and in place on that side. The right side of the photo is the southeast corner of the shop. This is where the main circuit breaker box would later be installed and the power line brought in to power the shop. Since permanent power was one of the last things installed, that corner wall was the very last place vertical wall panels were installed. The heavy hanging wire that you see feeds up the wall, across the ceiling, and over to a sub-panel on the north wall. Here is a schematic drawing which shows the main box and where the conduit runs through the ceiling to the sub-panel. I created several schematic drawings like this of the various electrical circuits, and I have to tell you they have proved invaluable already. Along with the photo history in my digital library, drawings like this allow me at a glance to recall information about any particular circuit, any particular box or switch. And at my age, I need reminding because otherwise I forget. By the way, the sub-panel line is encased in 2-inch plastic conduit. Having a sub-panel on the opposite wall allowed me to hook circuits from that side of the building to the sub-panel. That in turn saved me a lot of wire and time running those same circuits all the way across the building to the main circuit panel. At this point, allow me to deviate for just a moment to give you some advice. Never, never, ever use a ladder on top of a scaffold like I did here. The scaffold was 7 to 8 feet high. The ladder on top allowed me to work at height of 14 to 15 feet. This is what I used to place the insulation boards in the ceiling. I knew this was dangerous, and I took every precaution I could think of. For example, I clamped 2x4 pieces on either side of the top of the scaffold so the ladder could not accidentally slide off the side. In addition, I always double checked that the scaffold was locked in place. And every time I went up or down, I was conscious of moving deliberately, slowly, and holding on. What I didn't expect was the unexpected hornet that one day flew out of the darkness towards my face while I was halfway up in the rafters. There was an immediate reaction on my part, like if you suddenly realized you were going to step on a snake and jumped back. When the hornet flew in my face, I didn't think, I reacted, and I began moving down the ladder immediately. And instead of watching where I was stepping, I was watching the hornet. And about the second step, I stepped into thin air and fell backwards nearly 10 feet onto the solid concrete floor. This is a fall I should not have survived. I landed on my butt, my back, my shoulder, my arm, and my head, all in a split second. And how I didn't die, how I didn't end up as a quadriplegic, how I didn't break one bone in my body is truly a miracle. I did have bleeding in my brain. I spent time in a trauma center and months with dizzy spells and recovery, some of which I'm still recovering from, maybe for the rest of my life. In the end, I lost my taste and my smell forever. But at the end of the day, I feel blessed to still be here. So for what it's worth, remember, being at height is dangerous, so be careful. And by the way, the left side photo here is the actual scene after the fall. You can see where the ladder ended up on the floor as I made a desperate grab for it, and it went down with me. After many months of recovery, I finally was able to go out and begin work again. This was the exact scene where I left it months earlier. You can see the last place where I had to close in the ceiling. That was where I was working when the hornet flew in my face. Now, instead of the scaffold, I used this cage on front of my forklift, which was much, much safer. Had I been using this all along, I wouldn't have fallen. Within a matter of days, the last of the ceiling was finally closed in, and for me, that was a watershed moment. Next, it was on to finishing putting up the ceiling panels. When this picture was taken, perhaps 3/4 of the ceiling panels were up and in place. Over the next several weeks, I would finish the remainder. I also continued to install fluorescent and LED lights along the way. The rest of the fans, they would come a bit later. Except for the north and part of the east walls, it was really beginning to look closed in, and it was really looking like a shop. This is a good picture of the 2 rows of LEDs when turned on. Most of the time, the LEDs alone put out sufficient light for the shop. But for those times when weary old eyes like mine need extra light, I have 4 banks of fluorescents. Each bank consists of 6 4-foot fluorescent units, with each unit having 6 bulbs. Here's how the switches are laid out at the small entry door. Each of the 4 upper left switches controls 1 fluorescent bank. The LEDs are controlled by the lower left switch closest to the door. That means if I'm working in one area of the shop and need more light, all I have to do is hit the switch for the fluorescent bank in that area. The extra lights were a significant expense to the overall project, but for me it was well worth it. With white interior walls and plenty of lights that I can control, I really could not be more pleased. At this point, it was time to close in the north wall and add the small door. As you can see, all the outside horizontal 2x4s were now nailed on and ready for metal. The first layer of insulation went between those 2x4s. Here's a view from inside after the small door was hung with the entire wall closed in and insulated with that first layer. In this next photo, you can see the second layer of insulation has now been added. Ultimately, the north wall got at least 4 layers, and much of it got 5 layers total, as I had some leftover insulation boards. 4 layers represents R30 value, and 5 layers represents R37.5 value. These last 2 photos show the north wall sheet metal now complete. Shortly, I would be closing in the front east wall with a door and metal as well. Since we were already talking about the sub-panel, here are a few pictures of the panel during construction. Once I got some lights and outlets installed, I hot-wired my 400-foot Romex extension cord from my garage to power the sub-panel. Then I could just plug into an outlet or turn a light on. Of course, once I got hooked up to the power company, that went away, but it worked fine as a temporary solution. Here are a couple more examples of where I took a picture and then doctored it to create a schematic of wiring or other items that would later be buried in the wall. These are invaluable if you later want to modify something, or perhaps have to figure out where an issue is, where a particular wire is buried, and so on. It didn't take long for me to do. I'd take a picture during the day, and then in the evening I would sit down on the computer and draft it out in a very short period of time. I promise you it will save hours and hours of frustration later. Once the north wall was enclosed, the header over the large pull-up door was my next project. I knew it was going to be extremely heavy, so I built it right on the forks of the forklift. After all, it was going to be the forklift that lifted it up into place, not me. Here is a picture schematic showing the materials and design. Basically, it was just over 10 feet wide and made up of 4 2x12s with 2 1/2 sheets of plywood and 2 3/4 sheets of plywood, all glued and heavily nailed together. On top of the header, I built in a couple vertical 2x4s to connect to the upper heavy banding around the building top. I really wasn't worried about the header sagging in the middle, but it just gave it more stability and tied it into the building better. I don't know how much it weighed, but it was a beast. It took me roughly 2 days to build and then another day to install. The next natural step was then to close in the remainder of the wall. My sister had been kind enough to give me this large window. She did some remodeling and this was one of the windows that got replaced. And since I thought it would be nice to look out from the shop towards the house, I grabbed it and incorporated it into the design. If you liked this video, gleaned a few ideas, and want to see how the build proceeded, please hit the like button and go to part 5 of how I built my pole barn shop. Remember, before adopting any idea, be sure to run it by a qualified professional. And if you're contemplating a project, good luck, and thanks for watching.